Here's a sentence that gets said in family arguments all over the world, in some version or another. After everything I did for you. And here's the sentence that usually comes back, sometimes out loud, sometimes only in someone's head. I didn't ask to be raised that way. Both of those sentences are true. That's the part nobody wants to hear, and it's the part I want to spend this entire video proving to you. This isn't a story about a selfish child or a controlling parent. It's a story about two people using the exact same word, family, to mean two almost opposite things, without either one realizing it. And once you see the actual mechanics of that collision, a huge amount of the conflict in your own family might start to make a very different kind of sense. So stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to have a framework for a fight you've probably been having for years without ever naming what it was actually about. Let's start with the shape of the collision itself, because I think most people misdiagnose it as a personality clash. My daughter is selfish. My mother is controlling. When it's actually something structural, something almost architectural, sitting underneath the personalities entirely. On one side of almost every version of this conflict is loyalty. Not loyalty as a feeling, but loyalty as an organizing principle. The idea that family membership comes with obligations that exist independent of how you currently feel. You show up for holidays because you're family, not because you feel like it that particular year. You take the phone call because it's your mother, not because the conversation is guaranteed to be pleasant. This model treats the family unit itself as something closer to sacred, something whose continuity matters more than any individual member's momentary preferences. On the other side is freedom, specifically the idea that a relationship's value is measured by how it actually feels to be inside it, moment to moment, not by the role someone occupies. Under this model, being someone's child doesn't automatically generate an obligation. The relationship has to earn its continuation, the same way any other relationship does, through how it actually feels to be in it. Neither of these is new. Both of them have deep roots in serious thinking about what a family is even for. And I think the reason this conflict feels so raw right now, in almost every family I've read about, is that we're living through a moment where an entire generation was raised inside the loyalty framework and is now raising, or being raised by, people operating inside the freedom framework, often without either side realizing that's what's actually happening. So let's bring in the people who've actually mapped this terrain, because I don't think we should try to resolve this with intuition alone. I want to start with Erich Fromm again, because his work keeps showing up in almost every episode of this channel for a reason. He seemed to understand, decades before most people, exactly the tension we're describing today. In a book called Escape from Freedom, written in the shadow of the Second World War, Fromm made an argument that sounds almost paradoxical at first. Freedom, real freedom, is not simply pleasant, it's heavy. When people are cut loose from tradition, from inherited roles, from the kind of automatic belonging that comes with rigid social structures, they gain enormous room to define themselves. And they also lose the psychological comfort of simply knowing, without having to decide, who they are and what they owe to whom. Fromm's argument was mostly about societies, not families specifically, but I think it maps almost perfectly onto what's happening at kitchen tables right now. Older generations, in many cases, grew up inside a version of family life that functioned closer to Fromm's escape from freedom. A clear structure, clear obligations, less negotiation, and in exchange, less of the exhausting burden of constantly having to decide, from scratch, what you owe the people around you. Younger generations, raised with more emphasis on individual psychology, personal boundaries, and self-definition, inherited more freedom, and, according to Fromm's logic, more of the weight that comes with it. Every relationship becomes something you have to actively justify continuing, rather than something you simply continue by default. Neither side asked for the framework they were raised inside. That's worth sitting with for a second. Nobody chose to be handed loyalty as default or freedom as default. It arrived the way language arrives, absorbed before anyone was old enough to evaluate it. I want to bring in a sociologist next, because I think Fromm gives us the psychological mechanism, but Robert Bellah gives us the cultural map of how we got here. Bellah, writing with a team of researchers in a landmark book called Habits of the Heart, spent years interviewing Americans about what they actually believed held relationships together. And what he found, again and again, was a deep and specifically American strand of what he called expressive individualism, the belief that the self and its authentic feelings are the ultimate source of meaning and moral authority, even inside commitments like marriage or family that used to be understood as obligations you kept regardless of feeling. Bellah wasn't writing specifically about parent-child estrangement, but his research helps explain why this particular collision feels so uniquely intense in American and broadly Western families compared to many other cultures around the world, where family obligation still functions closer to the loyalty model, largely unquestioned. Bellah's interviews showed people increasingly evaluating every relationship, including family, through the lens of whether it served their authentic self-development. A framework that would have seemed almost incomprehensible to earlier generations, for whom the question, does this relationship serve my personal growth, simply wasn't the operating question at all. The operating question was closer to, am I fulfilling my role? This is where I think the generational math becomes really clear. If you were raised primarily inside a role-based framework, you are a daughter, a son, and that role comes with content that doesn't depend on your feelings. And your children were raised, even partially, inside this more expressive, self-authorized framework. You are, in a very real sense, negotiating across two different operating systems, not two different personalities. Two different definitions of what a relationship is even for. I want to bring in some harder data here, because I don't want this to stay purely theoretical. Psychologist Twenge has spent years tracking exactly this kind of generational shift using large data sets. Surveys given to millions of people across decades, asking the same questions to different generations at the same age. Her research consistently finds a measurable rise in individualism as a cultural value across recent generations. Greater emphasis on personal choice, self-expression, and psychological authenticity, and correspondingly less automatic deference to traditional authority structures, family included. This isn't Twenge's opinion. It's a pattern that shows up repeatedly across large-scale, replicated survey data tracked over real time. What I find useful about Twenge's research specifically is that it takes this entire conversation out of the territory of kids these days complaints, which I think most people, understandably, get defensive about. This isn't a story about one generation simply being worse at commitment than a previous one. It's a measurable, broad cultural shift in what people believe relationships are supposed to provide. And that shift didn't happen because any individual child decided to be more selfish than their parents. It happened because the entire cultural water everyone is swimming in changed. Now let's bring this back to the specific fight. This is actually causing inside families, because I think this is where the two frameworks stop being abstract and start explaining real arguments you may have had yourself. Under the loyalty framework, when an adult child pulls back, sets a boundary, or goes quiet, it registers as a violation, a broken obligation, something closer to betrayal, because the entire framework assumes relationships are held together by role, not by ongoing negotiation. You're my child. This is what family does, is a completely coherent sentence inside that framework. It's not manipulation. It's the actual internal logic of how that person understands what family means. Under the freedom framework, the same pulling back registers as something closer to self-preservation, even health. I need distance because this relationship, as it currently exists, isn't serving my well-being, is equally coherent. Inside that framework, It's not selfishness. It's the actual internal logic of how that person understands what a relationship is for. Here's the part that I think is genuinely difficult to sit with, and I want to say it as clearly as I can. Both of these are legitimate moral frameworks. Neither one is simply correct, while the other is simply wrong. Philosophers have argued about the relative weight of obligation versus autonomy for centuries, long before anyone was estranged from their mother over a group chat. What's happening inside individual families right now is a personal, often painful, lived version of a genuinely old philosophical disagreement. Except nobody in the argument thinks of it that way. Each side usually just thinks the other person is behaving badly. I want to bring in one more voice here, because I think he offers the most direct bridge between this abstract framework and what to actually do about it. Joshua Coleman, whose research on estrangement we've referenced in earlier episodes, has made an observation that I think ties this whole episode together. He notes that many parents, especially those raised inside stronger loyalty frameworks, experience their adult child's boundary setting as a rejection of family itself, when the child usually experiences it as an attempt to have a healthier version of that same family. The child isn't trying to end the loyalty framework. They're trying to renegotiate its terms using the only framework they were actually given the tools for, the freedom-based one, where relationships require ongoing consent, not just historical role. Coleman's research suggests that the families who navigate this collision most successfully aren't the ones where one side simply wins the philosophical argument. They're the ones where both people learn to translate between frameworks, where a parent can hear, "I need space," not as "you weren't a good parent," but as "I'm trying to relate to you using tools that feel true to me," and where an adult child can recognize that a parent's hurt reaction to a boundary isn't automatically manipulation. Sometimes it's simply someone experiencing, for the first time, what it feels like when the framework they were raised inside no longer automatically applies. I think that translation work is genuinely the whole task. Not picking a side between loyalty and freedom. Both frameworks have real wisdom inside them, and honestly, most healthy relationships end up needing pieces of both. Pure loyalty without any freedom curdles into obligation, without any actual affection behind it. Exactly the kind of empty duty Bellah's interview subjects were pushing back against. But pure freedom without any loyalty risks something else. Relationships so conditional, so constantly up for renegotiation, that nobody ever gets to feel the kind of stability Fromm suggested people actually crave, even while they're busy escaping structures that felt too rigid. Maybe the actual goal isn't picking one framework and defeating the other. Maybe it's building something that borrows from both. Relationships stable enough to survive disagreement, the way loyalty promises, but also responsive enough to actually change when something isn't working, the way freedom demands. Which is a lot to ask of any family. But I don't think it's impossible, and I think naming the actual structure of the disagreement, rather than fighting about it as if it's a personality flaw on either side, is very often the first real step toward building that. If this reframed a fight you've been having in your own family, if you've been arguing about a phone call or a holiday or a boundary, and it never occurred to you that you might actually be arguing about two entirely different definitions of what family owes each other, that's exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to untangle. The third voice is here for exactly this ache, so if you want more of this, subscribe, because we're going to keep working through it, episode by episode. Next time, we're going to look specifically at what happens when this collision plays out, not just in conversation, but across an entire holiday season. The highest stakes, highest pressure moment for loyalty and freedom to collide, and what both sides can actually do differently when it does. That's next time, here on The Third Voice.